All right, good evening, gentlemen. We are holding in the middle of the 7th chapter of the Holy Tanya of Tanya Kadisha. We are learning about something called Klippas Nega. Klippas Nega is the Alter Rebbe's middle ground, so to speak, as much as any middle ground exists in the worldview of the Alter Rebbe. In the previous chapter, we learned that the opposite of holiness is called the three impure klippas. And really, there's in truth, the more general breakdown is there's holiness, and then there's sitra achra. There's holiness, and then there's everything else. And really, this remains true in the Alter Rebbe's worldview. We're not going back on that statement. That really, to the Alter Rebbe, there's holiness, and then there's everything else. Everything else is, in some sense, all the same thing. Because as we have explained now multiple times in chapter 1, and now in this chapter, even neutral reality, if you believe that existence is a divine creation, if you believe that God precedes existence, then even the statement, I just exist, meaning without God, a neutral existence per se, is in some sense a denial of the reality of God. And in fact, that's the topic of our chapter. The previous chapter, was about the three impure klippas, which are in active denial of the Creator. There is a qualitative denial, right, where they say, only I exist. I cannot be reconciled with the reality of God. Klippas Nega is a much more, as I keep saying, is a very interesting category. It's a category that is of very great importance to the Alter Rebbe's whole worldview. And it's interesting, it's fascinating because it's so different, and I hope tonight to explore maybe some of the ways in which this is the case. The way we see Klippas Nega, the way we see this middle ground, this neutral level, which is just existence per se, which you would think, how could existence per se be a negative thing or a positive thing? It just seems neutral. But we're going to explore how, because the Alter Rebbe's view of God is that existence derives from God, rather than existence being synonymous with God, because the Alter Rebbe sees all things as godly, rather than as merely existent in their truest and ultimate form, in their truest being. Therefore, even the neutral category of Klippas Nega is not really so neutral in the Alter Rebbe's view. The neutral category of Klippas Nega, or as we translated at the end of last week's class, the translucent klippa, the illuminated klippa that lets some of the light of the divine through, even that klippa constitutes in some way a denial of God. And really our goal should be to make everything holiness. And in fact, that is our goal. Our goal is to transform everything, even Klippas Nega, and the three impure klippas, which are transformed not through being involved with them, but by not being involved with them, as we're going to see as we go further through Tanya. The goal is to transform is to reconcile all realities to what they truly are, which is divine. That's what everything is. Everything is rooted in godliness. The only question is how alienated, how distant, how much has that been forgotten, the true reality of the thing. And of course, it's not everything's fault. God makes the world this way. This is part of the act of creation. This is not in fact, we're going to talk about that a little bit tonight as well, how it's the way God makes the world. It's not anyone's fault, which is one of the ways in which perhaps some have argued Judaism takes a very different view of things than perhaps some other religions, because in our view, the world was made to be separate from God. It's not something that human beings did by choice. It's something that God did sort of unilaterally, as it were, and we're here dealing with his decision, and that involves some famous stories, like the story in the Garden of Eden and things like that, which, God willing, we're going to get to. So I'm going to read just a little bit, and then we'll have a discussion. I actually want to go back because we keep reading it right at the end of class just to finish the sentence. I'm not explaining what we're talking about. So I would actually like to go back to page Yud Aleph in the Hebrew, page 26 in the English, the beginning of chapter 7. I want to start with V'chein, which is one in the middle of a line, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines into the chapter. V'chein, I'm sure in English it's something like so too. As well as, it's the end of the line, about halfway down the paragraph in the English in chapter 7 that starts as well as. Yeah. Okay, so the Alter Rebbe starts the chapter with a whole list. He says, the animal soul, the souls of the animals that are, and the domesticated and wild animals, and the fowl and the fish that are kosher and permitted to eat, which again, we have an asterisk there about kosher and permitted to eat. We're going to have to eventually, closer to the end of this chapter, I believe is the best place to do it. We'll go more into exactly how do you make these distinctions, because we're going to see there's not just a dimension of the way God creates it, there's also the dimension of what we bring to the table through our action in the tradition of Judaism, which is all about us acting together with God to create, right? Well, sometimes we work together with God, as we're going to see in the 7th chapter of Tanya, to create a mess. Is what we join together to create. But sometimes we work together to create holiness and transform the world, which is all part of the plan, nothing to get too anxious about. But all of these things, meaning all of these things that are kosher, right? The idea of what we mean by kosher to eat, right, in the generalizable sense, as the Alter Rebbe is going to say, is that they can be elevated to godliness. This is really the distinctive, as we're going to say later soon, this is in practical terms, this is the distinctive nature of Klippas Noga. Rather than being the realm of the forbidden, right? A cheeseburger, in terms of eating at least, well, really a cheeseburger even benefiting, right? A cheeseburger is in the 3 impure klippas. A Jew cannot elevate it. A Jew is meant to stay away from it, right? There's nothing that we can do that can make it holy. A pair of tefillin is holy. In other words, it's holy inherently because it's tefillin, right? There's nothing to do to it. It's holy already, right? We made the components of the tefillin holy by making the tefillin. We elevated the leather, right, that was used in it. And what was the leather? The leather was part of a kosher animal, right? And that kosher animal was elevated by our decision. So you have one cow, right, which is a kosher species. It's fundamentally klippas noga. God makes it in the realm of the permitted, which is the mysterious middle area of life that is neither forbidden by the Torah nor commanded by the Torah. So you have a cow, and you're free to choose what to do with the cow. You can take the cow and make it into a cheeseburger, in which case you drag down an animal that was in the realm of the permitted into the 3 impure klippas, as we're going to read later in the chapter. Or you can make it into tefillin and elevate it to holiness. And that's really the word permitted, as we're going to read. Mutar actually means free to go. It means untied, not tied down, is really what mutar means. Permitted, right? So when we say it's permitted by Torah law, means it's metaphysically not solid. It could go either way. It's this half and half neutral realm. So all of these things, kosher, the Jewish animal soul, as we already mentioned in chapter 1, the kosher animals, right? These are all created as a form of klippas noga. And now continues the Alter Rebbe, and he says v'chein, and so too kiyum v'chayus, the sustaining and vitality, kol hamaisa dibur umachshava benyana elam hazeh, of all action, speech, and thought in matters of this world, she'ein bahem tzad isur, which do not have any aspect that is forbidden. And when the Alter Rebbe says no aspect that is forbidden, the Alter Rebbe is going to now go into how much he means. What's the standard for not forbidden? He says, Lo sheresh, not in a root, v'lo anaf, and not in a branch of one of the 365 bands of the Torah, negative commandments, the thou shalt not, right? Mishasa mitzvahs, lo yisaseh, 365 negative commandments, va'anfeyan, and all of their branches, deraisa v'derabbanan, in the written law and in the oral law, meaning to say, if something is forbidden in some rabbinic way, in a very slight way, it does not count for this category. So thoughts, so actions, speech, and thought that are not forbidden, rak she'enam l'shem shemayim, It is merely that they are not performed for the sake of heaven. Ella ratzon haguf v'cheftzei v'ta'avasei. Rather, for the will of the body and its desire, and literally translated, its lusts, right? This translation is actually problematic. It has the wrong connotation. There's a reason for this. Because, as everyone points out, the commentaries on Tanya point out, if a person, let's say a person, so thought, speech, and we're trying to say it's klipas noga, right? It's in the realm of the neutral. It's not something that's forbidden. It's just something that's not for the sake of heaven, which is really the goal with all permitted actions, is to do them l'shem shemayim, for the sake of heaven. The Rebbe has many sichos where the Rebbe says there's two levels. There's kol ma'asecha yu l'shem shemayim, which means all of your actions should be for the sake of heaven. And then there's a deeper level, which is called b'chol derechecha de'ehu, in all of your ways know him, right? Which means that it's not just done secondarily for the sake of heaven, right? In other words, something that's done for the sake of heaven is like I could go to work a job in order that I'm able to give tzedakah and do other mitzvahs, right? For example, so that's for the sake of heaven. And then b'chol derechecha de'ehu is deeper. B'chol derechecha de'ehu means that in your job itself you see God, whatever that means, right? It's a deeper, more profound level in which it's not just for the sake, it's not just a means to godliness, but it's actually an experience or an expression of the divine itself. But this is the goal. The goal is to be for the sake of heaven. If it's for the sake of heaven, it's holy, right? If it's forbidden, then it's the three impure klippas. But then you have this middle ground, which actually can be a little bit difficult to find in Torah law, because Torah law is very expansive on what is both commanded and forbidden. These are large realms of what one is obligated in and what is forbidden, right? And as people point out, a lot of things connected with the desires of the body are actually forbidden. For example, if a person eats just because they want to eat for the pleasure of eating, this is called a trait of being gluttonous, and it is forbidden. You're not supposed to do it. You're not supposed to eat just for enjoyment. You're supposed to eat so you have sustenance so you can serve God. So what does that leave, right? You have, on the one hand, you have eating because you enjoy it, which you're not supposed to do and is in some way forbidden by the Torah, in which case you're involved in the three impure. This is an action of the three impure klippas, right? There's an action of qualitatively denying holiness. Then, but if you are eating for the sake of heaven, right? Like we're going to say, if you eat in order that you have the energy to pray and study, for example, right? Then, on the contrary, that's holiness. That's not the middle ground, right? Because you've elevated. That's called elevating your food, right? You're using your food for a holy purpose. So it becomes a question of what's the middle ground, right? So what's left, right? You're not eating for enjoyment. You're not eating for in order to do good things, right? So why are you eating? So that's how you have to read the language of the Alter Rebbe. You're eating because it's a desire of the body, right? What do we mean by desire of the body? We don't mean a glutton who lusts for the enjoyment of food. That's not what we mean. In a way, I think you could even argue, maybe this is my own thing that I'm adding in here. It's hard to understand why the body, rather than say the animal soul, but the body would desire to be gluttonous, right? Because the body doesn't have a mind of its own, so to speak, right? The body is for all of the wonders of the body, right? It's the animal soul that has gluttonous desires, not the body, right? So the question is, what do we mean by the desires of the body? And the commentaries on Tanya explain, you're eating just to be healthy. That's why you're eating. This is the middle ground, right? You're eating just to be healthy. You're not eating because, which is very, it's hard to know where to start. First of all, you're not eating just for enjoyment. Right. So in other words, it's not emptiness. It's not something that you're doing just for gluttonous reasons. You're eating mindfully and with a purpose. So you may start to hear that a lot of this is what a lot of people talk about nowadays, is the highest morality, which is going to be the next point, that in Tanya, it's not the highest morality. You're also not eating for the sake of heaven. It has nothing to do with God. You're simply eating because the body has a physical need for food. And if you don't eat, the body is going to be lacking something. Right? The body, which literally the body is going to be wanting something, literally, right? That's what a want is. The body you want because you lack. And the body naturally, as we know, that if you don't give the body enough nutrients for 5 minutes, the body starts to literally deteriorate, right? the body starts to not function as well when it hasn't been you don't have to ask Jews about this. Jews know this very well. If it's been more than 5 minutes since the last time you ate, it's an issue, right? So, what this means is, at the deeper level, and really this is the hidden depth here, so we're going to take a little bit of a detour. I've been told, I won't name who said such things, I've been told by some people the detour is their favorite part. So I won't name names, but we're going to make a slight detour. Some people are text averse. That's a different way of putting it. I'm sure it's no one here. Anyway, there's a realm of human wisdom called ethics, in which people try and figure out what's the correct way to live. There's obviously many different, as in anything, there's many different shittas and many different, meaning many different opinions, many different approaches. However, what was traditionally the most popular philosophic, rationalistic approach to how a human being is meant to behave is that a person is meant to always be seeking their own perfection, is really how you would describe it, right? It was once a much more widespread belief. Nowadays, for various reasons we would take much too long to go into here, it's not really as widespread. It's widespread today in an implicit way because it's very hard to shake because it makes so much sense, but we don't talk about it in this sense as much anymore. But there was once a widespread belief that everything has an inherent essential nature, which means to say that a human being is not just an arrangement of matter that happens to be in a certain arrangement, but rather a human being is a spiritual category. There is a truth called the truth of being a human being, which is the source of the human being's nature, right? I'm not telling you anything that we don't say in Chassidus, by the way. And that source of truth determines what is best for a human being, right? Just as the truth of being an acorn or being a frog determines what is best for those creations, right? Each one according to their nature. I read once a beautiful letter from the Rebbe. This is now a diversion off of the diversion, but not really, on the same topic. I once read a letter that the Rebbe wrote to someone. Someone wrote the Rebbe and asked, they said they would take on more Torah and mitzvahs, but they feel that the mitzvahs are very limiting of their freedom. In other words, the mitzvahs are which at a simple understanding, it's very easy to appreciate, right? A person who's used to doing whatever they want, right? Comes the mitzvahs, and at a very practical level, however you want to look at it, and I'm sure the Rebbe gave the person a much better perspective, obviously, but at a practical level, it's not your choice what to do with this 5 minutes. In this 5 minutes, you have to wrap your tefillin, right? There's just no getting around that, right? So the person said, how can you say that the Torah's values are synonymous with freedom, which is something that the Rebbe said many times, by the way. So it's not just a mishagas that the person is bringing from the outside. The Rebbe himself said that the Torah is the greatest freedom, right? The Rebbe, you always said, charos ala luchos, the words were carved on the tablets that came from Mount Sinai. Don't read charos, read cheros. Freedom was on the luchos. Freedom was on the tablets. The Torah is freedom, right? So how can you say the Torah is freedom if the Torah is controlling my every move, so to speak? And the Rebbe wrote back, to make a long story very short, that an answer directly along these lines. The Rebbe wrote back that the freedom of a being is determined by their nature, right? If you have a rock and you put it in your garden and the rock is there for 70 years and it never changes, it's just sitting there, right? Would you say that you've in some way deprive the rock of freedom? And obviously the answer is ridiculous because the rocks don't do anything. Rocks just sitting there, that's what they do, right? But if you take a plant, right, and you don't give it sun and you don't give it water and you let it become stunted, right, and unable to grow, unable to change, right, that would be called depriving this plant of its best self, right? You hear this phrase now from the self-help community about be your best self, right? So the plant's best self is when it can grow, right? It can change. That's what makes it a plant. The plant is from tzemech. Tzmicha means growth, right? Its essence is its growth. If it stays the same, it's ruined. It's dead. It's a bad plant. The whole point is that it's supposed to have a dynamism to it, unlike a rock, right? But on the other hand, if you leave the plant and you feed it and you water it and you treat it with love and it's in the same pot for year after year after year, as it grows, etc., and it's in its natural way, you wouldn't say you've taken away its freedom. But if you take an animal, right, if you take a dog and you put a dog in a box and you never let it out of that box, right, you feed it and you give it what it needs, but it has to stay in one place, right, you've deprived that animal of its freedom, because animals, being animate, right, like to move. They need to be able to, for their perfection, they can't be rooted in one spot. They not only grow like a plant, they also need to be able to roam around, right, and have motion and a certain amount of free expression to be free. Otherwise, you lock up a dog like that, it's actually a terrible thing, right? It's cruelty to animals, which is banned even for non-Jews by the Torah, a terrible thing to do. Then, but on the other hand, if you have your dog and you never ever teach your dog how to spell or teach it basic mathematics, right, or teach it how to read, that is not depriving the dog of freedom. In fact, your dog will be very, very happy if you never teach it how to read, right? Whereas if you have a human child and you never teach it how to read, and you never teach it how anything about the world, you never enrich its mind, right? You never teach it how to speak properly, that is called abuse of a child, right? A human being needs to express its greater range of freedoms. It does what a plant does, and it does what an animal does, but there's an additional category, which is the intellect/social life, and really the two are together, of a human being has to be fostered. And so the Rebbe said, and a Jew is a special subcategory of a human being that has something called a godly soul. And a Jew needs and desires to do Torah and mitzvahs. And a regular person, if you prevent them from putting on tefillin, it's like not teaching a dog to read, right? It's like you've not taken anything away, so to speak. It's like leaving a rock just sitting in your garden, right? Obviously, because it doesn't fit the category of their freedom, right? But a Jew, and this is really a profound Hasidic view of it, right? This is where everything so far, I think, you would say, is a very traditional philosophical view. Everything else the Rebbe says, when the Rebbe, the additional Hasidic twist is that the Rebbe says that a Jew has an additional essence, which he gets from the second chapter of Tanya, right? An additional essence, a godly soul, which desires more than anything to do Torah and mitzvahs. Or as the Alter Rebbe said, it's brought in the Hayom Yom twice, that a Yid niter will niter ken sein, chas v'shalom abgerissen von Elokus. The Alter Rebbe's position was that a Jew does not want to and cannot be separated from godliness, right? That's what a Jew really wants, right? And to deprive a Jew of that is to deprive them of their freedom. This was the Rebbe's letter. So there's this concept. Okay, now we're back to only one level of detour. So there's this concept of things having an essence, which determines their nature, right? Be your best self. Be the best that you can be. This is obviously in bumper sticker form. There are many. You could write huge, and people have written huge tomes and works figuring out how this works exactly, and of course with much disagreement about what the true essence of a thing is and what's the true essence of a human being and how to approach that true essence. But the core of being your best self, living up to your core humanity, right? Or as we would put it in our extremely therapeutic culture nowadays, right? Being healthy. Right? A human being should be a healthy human being, meaning they should be enriched and have a wholesome environment, all of which sounds great. You should have, in other words, I'm not putting these things down, obviously. A person needs to have good food, which is one whole health movement, right? And a person has to have good and healthy thoughts, which is another whole health movement. And a person has to have a healthy body, right? Healthy exercise and use of their body, which is a whole other health movement, right? And you put them all together, right? And you start getting something like you're drawing an arrow towards human perfection, right? And then you can extend it into things that people like to extend it to, like making a lot of money, for example, things like that, right? Which you could argue to a certain extent. Now, at some point, earning a lot of of money crosses over to being like gluttony, where it's the three impure klippas, right? But money for the basic needs of a human being, which your basic needs, by the way, is not a universal standard in Judaism. It's judged soul by soul, and it's questionable whether really any human being's basic needs can be determined from the outside by another human being. Just FYI. In other words, there's a degree of subjectivity and mystery to it that makes it much harder to mandate the perfect ordered society than people may assume. But the bottom line is a person has needs as a physical being. There's a list of things that a person needs, right? Just to be healthy, just to be a non-lacking human being, right? A wholesome human being with all of your parts and all of your parts, spiritual, emotional, mental, physical, all your parts working together, right? There's an idea that a person should be healthy like that. The Alter Rebbe comes and says something which you might think is actually not so radical in a way. In other words, you could interpret it less radically. I'm just here to tell you, having read how the story ends and having seen some of the Rebbe's sichos based on the Alter Rebbe's teachings, that the Alter Rebbe is saying something incredibly radical, which is that all of that is the Nefesh HaBahamis. All of that is animal soul. That's Klippas Noga, right? Human perfection, right? Being a wholesome, healthy human being is in the realm of the permitted, right? And it really goes back to these words of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe says, things that the body wants, right? You're lacking literally as a physical, incarnate human being, right? There are certain things that a person is lacking and that need to be fulfilled, right? And a person needs to fulfill them, right? A person has, Maslow, right? The hierarchy of needs. There's things that a person needs just to be a wholesome human being, right? There's a certain essential humanness with certain needs and a certain perfection, and that's what a human being should strive for. And a human being, to a certain extent, the body naturally tends in that direction, tends to its own perfection. As they say in the therapeutic culture, the body knows what it needs, right? Etc. So the Alter Rebbe would agree, the body does know what it needs. However, what the body needs and the needs of the body are Klippas Noga, right? Which means they are not holy. They are not holy. Which means if they're not holy, right, that means they are not the form of perfection at which the Alter Rebbe is aiming, right? Now, sometimes you could argue that doesn't make such a difference, right? For example, the Alter Rebbe would say a Jew is much more important that they should pray than that they should eat, right? However, being not hungry is a prerequisite to davening properly, right? So in other words, yes, it's true that you have a natural desire to eat like that, right? All we're asking you to do is to use that natural desire to eat and make sure it's a stepping stone and you can elevate it on the way to prayer, right? By making this food that you're eating so that you won't be hungry during davening. You'll have the energy to daven, right? So that's elevating the Klippas Noga. But other times, this sort of thing gets in the way of human perfection, right? Gets in the way of the perfection the Alter Rebbe is aiming at, even if it doesn't descend into klipa. I don't know if you can really say that, by the way. I'm not 100% sure about this point. I have a question myself on this point. But what it sounds like to me we're saying, which is the best I can do, and I'll disclaim that this is the way I see it, right? What it sounds like we're saying is that sometimes what a person should be doing for their own perfection can get in the way and not be 100% consonant with the body's needs for its own health at this time, right? Obviously, in Chassidus, there's an obvious concept, which we talk about later in Tanya, called self-sacrifice, right? Which is when you do the exact opposite of being a rational human being that cares about their own safety, right? Health and safety, right? If the missionary came to you, as Rabbi Shochat used to say so memorably, right? And he says, either you kiss this cross or the sword kisses you, right? He would say in his Swiss accent, right? Either you kiss this or this kisses you, right? As they used to come and say to the Jews. And if you polled the therapists, the shtetl therapists, which itself is a basis of a whole comedy, a whole TV show you could make, the shtetl therapist. But if you polled the shtetl therapists, right, the shtetl therapist would say, "Are you insane? Are you insane? You don't mean it when you kiss that idol, when you bow down to that idol. You have to bow down to the idol. Are you crazy? Don't be crazy. Let the die for this mishagas. A human being has to be normal. A human being has to be healthy. A human being has to be wholesome. Okay, so you'll be living a bit of a double life, but you have to at least be healthy. Don't give up the whole game here, right? Whereas the Alter Rebbe, on the contrary, says the Jewish tendency is to die, right? In that situation. For example, that's obviously a radical example, but it is an example where you see that neutral, just bodily existence is not only not the right thing to do, it's not even a stepping stone to the right thing to do. It's actually the opposite of the right thing to do. That's just at a very practical level. We can speak now more abstractly, right? There's a debate in the Talmud, a very famous, obviously there's lots of debates in the Talmud. There's a very famous debate in the Talmud where it discusses how the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel argued for 3 years. You know what the question was they argued about? It's a very famous Gemara. They argued the question, is it better for man to have been created or not to have been created? It's one of my all-time favorite little passages in the Gemara. Very short. It's one little paragraph. Is it better for the world to have been created or not to have been created? The house of Hillel says it's better, not for the world, pardon me, for man to have been created is the question. Hillel says it's better for man to have been created. Shammai says better for man not to have been created. And they debate for 3 years. I don't know what that means. I would be fascinated to find out what that means, that they debated this concept for 3 years. I don't even have an image of what it looked like when the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai argued on one day, never mind for 3 years. So if anyone has any insight, I would love to find out about that. I don't have an image of it. At the end of the 3 years, they side with Shammai. Yeah, one of the times. Shammai wins. At the end of the 3 years, they've convinced the house of Hillel it's better for men not to have been created. Shocking conclusion to the Gemara, by the way. If you're not shocked, you're not thinking about it enough, right? Judaism is the life-affirming religion, right? Choose life at all costs. Life, preserve life. The Gemara comes and says that even Hillel, who started out saying it's better to be created, being created is good, even they, in the end, agree, better not to have been created. What's the conclusion of the story? Now that we have been created, right, a person should examine their deeds. That's what the Talmud says. Now that we have been created, a person should examine their deeds. Which is interesting because it makes it sound like they're arguing with God for their own non-existence, which is quite interesting, right? They're saying God has made it, for some reason, God has made us, even though we have decided that it would be better for us not to have been created, but God, for some reason, has created us, and so a person should examine their deeds. What's going on in this piece of Talmud? So the Rebbe, in the course of explaining the debates of Hillel and Shammai across the whole Shas, across the entire Talmud, the Rebbe has an incredible, like a groundbreaking, mind-blowing explanation of what's going on in this passage of the Talmud. The basic disagreement, as the Rebbe explains it, between Hillel and Shammai across the entire Talmud is a disagreement about whether we go after the potential or we go after the actual. That's the debate, right? For example, famous example, on Hanukkah, Hillel says that we should do like we do, which is you light 1 candle, then 2 candles, then 3 candles. Shammai says decrease. You start with 8 candles, 7 candles, 6 candles. Hillel is the one who wins. Hillel is the one who wins that debate. So why? Why do they have the positions that they have? They have the positions that they have because Hillel goes after the potential, right? In other words, Pardon me. Hillel goes after the actual, right? Obviously. Because on the first day, you actually only have one day, right? On the second day, right? On the third day, etc. Whereas Shammai goes after the potential, right? So on the first day, what do you have in potential? 8 days. On the second day, you have in potential less, so you decrease, right? And the Rebbe explains how incredibly, with an incredible insight, how all of these seemingly different disagreements of Hillel and Shammai about very diverse matters in the Talmud all come back to this essential point. I'm not sure if this is the Rebbe's innovation. I have a feeling it's not. It may come from the Rogatchover Gaon or even earlier, but the Rebbe explains very thoroughly in many different cases, etc. It may be the Rebbe's innovation. I wish I remembered more about the source of it. So the Rebbe comes and he explains this debate of Hillel and Shammai. Better to have been created, better not to have been created. So the Rebbe explains it like this. The soul, we know, exists before it is brought down into the world. And the soul, as we learn in Chassidus, is standing before God above with love and fear, right? And serves God constantly. That's its existence, right? Which makes sense because the soul up above is totally aware of the Creator at every moment, right? And so just like all the angels and all the other spiritual beings, the soul is serving God, right? Constantly. We also know, as it explains in Chassidus much later in Tanya, that when the soul comes down and is incarnated in this physical world, the soul, no matter how much love and fear and spiritual feeling and spiritual heights the soul attains down here, it will never equal the level that the soul had before the soul was brought down into the world. The spiritual level and spiritual sensitivity of a soul that has no connection to physicality, right? No embodied soul can ever compare to that level of refinement, that level of spirituality that the soul has, yes. So what's this debate? The debate is it better for man to be created or not? In other words, there's something called the potential of man, which is man before he's born. Man as he exists one with the Creator, right? Is what we in Chassidus would say, the soul as it's above, before the person is born, right? So Hillel says there's an advantage to the actual. In other words, in heaven you have only the potential of the soul to really be so great, but it has unactualized potential, right? Because it hasn't actually lived a life of doing mitzvahs and serving God, even though it has the spiritual wherewithal where all it wants to do is serve God, right? Famous story Mendel Futterfass would tell many times. I'm sure I've told you the story many times in the class, maybe elsewhere, about the two souls meet, right? One of Mendel Futterfass's stories. Two souls meet. One soul coming up after passing away from this world, the other soul coming down to be born, right? And the soul that's coming down is very nervous, and it says to the soul that's going up, what's it like down there? And the soul that's going up says, down there, it's incredible. It's incredible. He says, tzitzis, you've heard of tzitzis, yes, and the soul going down says, have I heard of tzitzis? Every day, infinite ranks of angels sing the praises of the mitzvah of tzitzis. Every time a Jew puts on tzitzis, it's like the whole universe turns over, and the white light of infinity shines upon us whenever a Jew puts on tzitzis. What about them? And so the soul that's going up says, down there, tzitzis is like 50 kopecks. You can participate in tzitzis. And the soul that's going down hurls itself down towards the earth and says, 50 kopecks, that's all I'm going. I'm rushing to be born. And the soul that's going up calls after him and he says, wait, I didn't tell you what you had to do to earn the 50 kopecks yet. This is a rich and sharp Hasidic tale, very Jewish. Anyway, so the soul, when it's above, wants to do mitzvahs. That's one of the lessons of the story. The soul wants to do mitzvahs, right? They can't. They want to serve God in the most actual way, which is in this world, fulfilling God's will, as we know from Chassidus, right? So they have all of these spiritual feelings. In fact, we already learned it in Tanya, right? What's the only way the soul can culminate, can actualize its love of God is through mitzvahs, right? So Hillel says there's an advantage to actually being born, right? There's an advantage to actually being created. Being created is good because you can actually serve God. Shammai, for their position, says, you already have this whole service of God already, right? In other words, the soul is there. The soul is ready for it. The soul is in a position where it's deepest, it's on fire with love of God. What do you actually have to put the tefillin on for, right? For the soul, it does nothing. The soul has all of this in potential. And on the contrary, as we said before, being incarnated and having a physical body actually ruins it. It gets in the way. It's a halt on the perfect love and fear of the soul, right? So why be born? This is the debate, right? Hillel says it's better to be born, right? It's better that man should be created. Shammai says, it's not better. It's worse. It's worse. It was better. You had it better when you were a soul up there. It was all better for you there. They debate for 3 years. What's the conclusion? Shammai wins, right? In other words, the conclusion is that what is better for the soul, what's better for a human being and better for the soul is not to be born. That's the conclusion. Right? The actual, what do you need? The actualization of your love and fear of God for. You need it, as Shammai would probably say, you need it like you need a hole in the head, right? To be in a physical body and actualize, to wrap a pair of leather straps, right? The soul is in an incredible cleaving to God with love and fear above, right? And it's perfect. It's perfect. All you're going to do is ruin it by bringing it into this actuality, Shammai says. And in the end, the house of Hillel agrees, right? Elamai, now we are born, which means to say what? And here's the connection to chapter 7 of Tanya, right? We are born, which means we're not here for our own self-perfection. A radical Hasidic idea. If we were here for our own self-perfection, where would we be? Not here, right? If it was about self-perfection, you didn't need to be born. For perfection, you don't need to be born. For perfection, it's a waste. This whole thing is a dead end, a detour, right? A waste of time, right? There's the before life, there's the afterlife, and then in between, you are all off doing who knows what, right? Even people who are great tzaddikim, in a sense, were off doing who knows what, because they were greater. They had a greater for themselves, for their own perfection. That's where they started, right? This is all, as explained richly in the tradition of Chassidus, this is all a great degradation to the soul. The soul is thrown me'igra rama labira amikta, it says later in Tanya, from a lofty tower to the deepest pit. The soul is thrown, right? But we are born, which means we're born not for us, but for God. That's the answer. That's the Hasidic explanation. The Hasidic explanation is you're not here for your own perfection, so get over it, right? It's a waste. Your own perfection to a large extent, you could even argue is klipas nega, to a large extent, right? The body, everything here is seeking its own perfection, right? A rock is seeking its own worldly perfection, right, etc. This is the nature of the world. And even if you view perfection through the realm of spiritual perfection and spiritual loftiness, right? You're still not going to get to the level you were before you were born. Why are we here in this world? We're here to serve God, not for our own self-perfection. Right? So this is the Hasidic view of self-perfection. And in fact, many times, the concept of working towards shleimus, right, which is a word and a term that is borrowed from many of the great Musar Sfarim and Jewish ethical works, right? In Chassidus, working towards self-perfection, it's not wrong. It's more subtle than that. It misses the mark. It's not hitting what the Alter Rebbe wants to hit. It's not why you're here, right? Self-perfection in many ways can be a wonderful thing, because if a person aims for spiritual self-perfection, they'll get very high. Their midos will become incredibly refined, right? All the things that Tanya says are good things the person will achieve if they're aiming for self-perfection in a Jewish lens, right? However, it doesn't hit what the Alter Rebbe wants to hit. And in Chassidus, there's this, it's hard to exactly put into words. There is a certain latitude that this gives Chassidus. There's a reason why in Chassidus, there's a reason why the Baal Shem Tov could see the quality of the most simple, unlearned Jew and see that it was of an infinite quality, right? Even though that Jew was so far from perfection, right? And it's connected to this idea. It's connected to this idea because if everything is organized in that hierarchy of there's spiritual perfection and then there's a little less perfect, a little less perfect, a little less perfect, right? So then that means that the simple Jew, how could you so praise and so value the qualities of that simple Jew that the Baal Shem Tov saw, right? Or as the Alter Rebbe says in the 32nd chapter of Tanya, the Jew you've never met and will never meet. How can you value their quality? You have no sense of their spiritual quality, right? And it could be very poor, right? It's quite imaginable. So there's a certain, it's very important in Chassidus, this concept. It's subtle, it's subtle to draw the connection, but it's very important. It's very important to realize that self-perfection is not the goal of Chassidus, right? In one sense, of course, you could argue it is, meaning depending what you mean by self-perfection. But generally speaking, for most meanings of what we mean when we say self-perfection is not the goal of the Tanya. The goal of the Tanya, what did we come to the Alter Rebbe asking for? We came to the Alter Rebbe asking for, in the Akdama, we want a connection to God. That's what we're here for, right? We asking the Alter Rebbe, I'm doing Torah and mitzvahs, right? Which means I have a certain level of perfection, presumably, right? A person comes to the Alter Rebbe and he says, I'm doing a lot of the right things. I'm saying a lot of the right things. I'm thinking a lot of the right things. So why is the God not real to me? Why do I not have a real connection with God? And part of the Alter Rebbe's answer is not you're being too imperfect. You're not great enough, right? That's not that part of the response is that whole thing about your personal spiritual level and your greatness can be a distraction from what you really want, right? If you really want God, it could be what you have to do is go and learn from the simple Jew, for example, which is something many a Hasidic master did say in many a Hasidic tale, right? You want to go learn from the simple Jew. You want to go learn from the shepherd boy. You want to go learn, right? This is, it's all part of the same thing. Why is Chassidus able to say that? Chassidus is able to say that because Chassidus' view of life in this world is that it's not for our self-perfection. Life in this world is to serve God, right? And God has this way of getting in places even where you think he shouldn't be. That's really how it works. You think a certain thing is perfection and that's synonymous with God. There's always a higher level where God says, that's not really for me. I'm going to go hang out with the simple shepherd boy, right? This reversal, this Hasidic reversal, which to people who don't have an appreciation for the flavor of Chassidus, it drives them nuts, right? Because to them it seems very whimsical, right? A whimsical sort of reversal, a nice thing, which to them smacks of a lack of order, right? A lack of appreciation for perfection, right? Can a Chassid appreciate perfection? They might ask in frustration, and the answer is that we do appreciate perfection, right? However, we read that Gemara to say that perfection is not why we're here, right? Perfection is something that the soul has when it's with God. We're here, as the Alter Rebbe is going to say later, we're here fighting. We're here fighting a war. This is not about perfection. This is a whole other type of campaign. And what we really want here is God. We're here to serve the King, right? In this war that we're fighting, which is why that passage of the Talmud says, now that you are created, now that God has decided to do for you that which is not in a sense best for you by creating you, right? Because it's for his needs, not for your needs, which to some non-Hasidic people almost sounds heretical, never mind, right? To say that you can even do something for God, right? We're here for his needs, not for our needs. And now that you're here, you should examine your actions. In other words, so if you're not here serving him, right, then this whole thing really was a waste of time, in other words, is the conclusion of the Talmud, right? If you're not busy serving, you're here to attain spiritual levels, you're here to enjoy yourself, you're doing anything else, right? It's all been a waste. You should have stayed in the storehouse of souls up above. So all of this you can see here in its most inchoate form. You can see the seed of it here in the 7th chapter of Tanya, where the Alter Rebbe says the body's desire, its natural, healthy desire for its own perfection, for its own, that it should simply be able to be, right? That desire is of Klipas Nega. That's not holiness. Holiness is something else. Holiness is something else. Holiness is bittul. That's not bittul. It may be very fine. It may be very spiritual. It may be very enjoyable. It may be very rich. It may have great qualities, right? For a body to be healthy. A healthy body may be a very great thing in a certain sense, and I'm sure it is. However, what it's all about is holiness. What it's all about, that's what we're aiming for. We're aiming not for, really all of this is just rephrasing something that you've heard before in Chassidus classes, which is that there's a difference between spirituality and godliness. There's a difference between ruchnius and elokus, between ruchnius and getlichkeit, right? There's a difference between that which is spiritual, that which is wholesome, that which is rich, that which is of great quality, versus that which is godly. That which is godly is sometimes associated with great quality and sometimes not, right? It decides. That's the scary part, right? The scary part, that's a different rant, but that's the scary part. The scary part is that God is out here deciding what he likes. That's the scary part, and is not consulting us in our appreciation and our understanding for what he likes. That's the really scary part, and that's an idea of bittul. If a person can internalize that on the contrary is a removal of yeshus. That's a removal of separation from God, right? It's a removal of separation from God to say it's not about what I appreciate to be perfect, it's about what you think is perfect. It's about what your perfection, right? Who are you, God? Okay, so that's a lot of Hasidic concepts and sort of worldview, sort of all tied and together on this idea. Continues the Alter Rebbe, continues the holy words of the Tanya. It's all for even if it's for the needs of the body, literally to keep the body alive, right? That a person is, for example, eating, right? It's literally for your physical needs to eat. But it is not being done for the sake of heaven. In order to serve God with one's body. The person's such actions and speech and thought are not better than the vital animal soul ba'atzma itself. In other words, they achieve no elevation over the animal nature. Why? For the obvious reason, they are expressions of the animal nature, right? That's it. Even if it's the simple, what we call in English the survival instinct and everything that goes with it, right? Even if there's nothing wrong with what you're doing, and in terms of being banned by the Torah, right? That instinct is of the animal. Right, that instinct is not of holiness. Yeah, it's the animal soul's instinct for survival, for taking care of itself. Exactly, it's not holy, it's not forbidden. It's just the animal soul. Right. It's noted in the commentaries on Tanya here, and maybe we can discuss this a little bit more later, that if you do a lot of eating, even if there's nothing wrong, for example, if you do listen to the call of your animal soul, even if you're not violating any of the Torah's commands, over time, this can become degrading to the soul. In other words, just because it's not forbidden, right, doesn't mean that there's not necessarily any damage to living this way. If a person is indulgent, even in their own health, right, again, it's not overindulgence, it's not for pleasure. Right? A person is indulgent over time in food that they need literally to live, right? That slowly makes the soul less and less attuned to godliness, not because it's evil, but because it's klipa, right? Which is different. Not because it's qualitatively evil, not because it's against God's will, but because it's physical, and it's about being a separate being from God and feeding that separate being from God. And over time, this makes a person grub. This makes a person more coarse. V'akol kasher lekol, all of these things, nishpa v'nimshach madrega hashenish b'klipos, they derive their vitality and are drawn forth from the second level of klipa, v'sitra achra, Shehi klipa revius, the fourth klipa, in addition to the three impure klipas from the previous chapter, hanikras klipas nega, which is called klipas nega. With these words, the Alter Rebbe, believe it or not, in 7 short chapters, some of them not really related, has finished his taxonomy of all reality. All things are now described by Tanya. You understand? There's nothing in the world that has now not been described by the Alter Rebbe in Tanya, at least in a general sense, right? Everything that a person is going to run into, everything that a Jew runs into in their life, right, has basically been described by the Alter Rebbe. Most of the time, as we keep pointing out, was spent discussing the soul, the souls themselves, and will continue to be discussion of the souls, which shows you what the real central reality and, so to speak, story and drama of life is. It's a soul story, right? However, the external universe, which we discuss in the context of the soul relating externally through its garments of thought, speech, and action, right? We have now laid out, there's basically 3 categories of thought, speech, and action. Yeah, there's thought, speech, and action, which is holy, the way the godly soul wants to relate. There's thought, speech, and action, which are of the 3 impure klippas, which are forbidden by the Torah, right, and which go against the will of God, and a person is to avoid them at all costs if they want to connect with godliness. And then you have the realm of klippas nega, which is the realm of the permitted, right? And not just all thought, speech, and action, but everything else that exists in the universe falls into naturally one of these 3 categories, either naturally or artificially, right? Either it's in one of those categories because God makes it that way, or it's in one of those categories because we made it that way, right? So for example, the cow, kosher species, kosher animal, God creates it to be klipas nega. We, when we make it into tefillin, when we make the leather into tefillin, we turn it into kedusha. Yes, for example. Okay. And more, as I keep saying, we'll get more into sort of how that works. We'll get more into like the taxonomy of all reality is something holy or klipas nega or 3 impure klipas. We'll get more into that toward the end of the chapter. So there's much more in a practical sense of what that means, but that's the general idea. So the Alter Rebbe has literally encompassed the whole world by now, right? Even though really all he's spoken about is the souls mostly, right? With a few extra things mentioned. He mentioned a few birds and animals and things like that by name explicitly, but generally speaking, the Alter Rebbe, by speaking about the souls, has now categorized everything in the entire universe. The Alter Rebbe's world has been fully described, at least in terms of the categories, etc., within it. The klipa is called klipas nega, as I said. The klipa is called klipas nega, which means the illuminated klipa. The term nega comes from the same place where we learn about the 3 impure klipas, which is Ezekiel's vision of the chariot. Ezekiel 1:4 talks about the nega. I don't know if a literal translation there will help you understand the 3 impure klipas versus klipas nega, but it's mentioned there. Right, there's a light, a klipa light, a light associated with the klippas, and that illumination is the klipa that's illuminated, or the translucent klipa, which is called klipas nega. Klipas nega is a mix of light and dark, which means it's a mix of opposition to godliness, revelation of godliness. Right, opposition to godliness, darkness. In this metaphor, revelation of godliness is light. Klipas nega is a mix. Right, what else is a mix of good and evil? Famously, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is mentioned in the book of Genesis, which is what the fruit was eaten from, and then everything, as some would say, was all downhill from there. That the eating from the tree of good and evil was the act that made our world a world of klippas, according to Chassidus. In other words, here we get to the juicy way of saying it. The eating from the tree was the completion of the creation. In other words, the world was not properly created until Adam and Eve ate from the tree, because then you had this whole plan of a world which was full of things that seemed to be separate from God, of klipa, in which good and evil are mixed. You see here, by the way, another connection. This is really just a side point for people who are interested in something a little bit deeper, just a note on something a little bit deeper. You see in the eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, if you learn about it in Chassidus, it's the knowledge of good and evil. Klipas nega is associated with intellect. In other words, klipas nega is which we've been calling neutral existence, is the realm of rationality. Rationality and neutral, meaning non-explicitly godly existence, is the realm of klipas nega. So it's the eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That knowledge is a knowledge of klipa. The way the Rebbe Rashab puts it, which I think is I think the Rambam almost says it explicitly in the Guide for the Perplexed, not in not in the Hasidic language, but the exact concept. The Rambam says right at the beginning in one of the first chapters of Mor Nevuchim, Guide for the Perplexed. The Rambam asks the question. It says after they eat from the tree that their eyes were opened, right? So the Rambam asks, how can their eyes be opened? How can they gain more knowledge from something that is a transgression? Right? God is perfect knowledge. God is omniscience, right? So as you move further from God and oppose God, you should not be getting more insight, more wisdom. What was their eyes open to, so to speak, right? In other words, if you're in the Garden of Eden before eating from the tree, you're in a godly realm. Surely you know more than you know after you commit the avera, right? The avera the sin is a destruction of information, so to speak. We would say in the language in our contemporary language. So the Rebbe Rashab, this is not exactly how the Rambam puts it, but the way the Rebbe Rashab puts it, because he quotes the Zohar, is that the Zohar says that they opened their eyes to the darkness of this world. In other words, they opened their eyes to knowledge. But what knowledge was this? And this is in consonance with the Rambam, degraded knowledge, not true knowledge. There's two different types of knowledge, which is something we'll find out more about in chapter 8, God willing. There's two different types of knowledge, right? The way the Rebbe Rashab describes it is that before they ate from the tree, good and evil were as distinguishable as anything else. In other words, you could distinguish good from evil. Good and evil looked different, right? As they say, if all the villains, if all the bad people in the world looked like Darth Vader, right, we'd be in a much better place. It would be much more difficult to end up in a bad place if all the evil things were obviously evil. The way the Maharal puts it is that the Torah says, what's something that's forbidden? The Torah says, don't wear wool and linen, right? Before the eating from the tree in the Garden of Eden, eating from wool and linen would be like sticking your hand in a fire now. Nobody sticks their hand in a fire. Sorry, eating from the tree. Wearing wool and linen before they ate from the tree would be like sticking your hand in a fire now. Right? Why does a person not stick their hand in a fire? Because it's obviously bad for you, right? Unless you're insane, right? You don't stick your hand in a fire because it hurts and it's bad, right? That's how evil worked before the eating from the tree, right? Before you ate from the tree, evil was bad and you didn't do it because why would you do it, right? It was inimical to existence, right? Existence per se was the opposite of evil, but that's no longer the case. Now, after the eating from the tree, right, good and evil become moral categories that you can only know intellectually, right? You can't see evil. You can't feel evil. Evil you have to know intellectually, which means the world has become a place of neutrality, existential neutrality, where evil has as much a claim to existence and reality as good does. Yeah. In other words, so the eating from the tree of the Garden of Good and Evil is what makes the world a world that's full of klippas, which is the next thing the Alter Rebbe is about to say. The Alter Rebbe is about to say, this world, we'll read it next week, God willing, this world is a world that is majority klippa. Okay, we'll continue.